All right, well, good afternoon. As it is just afternoon here in Portland, Oregon today, I'm Kara Toronto, TAO's Chief Operating Officer, and I have the privilege of introducing our midday program for Impact, Talent and Culture. Today, I'm joined by Ruthie Ditzler, Marketing and Regional Program Coordinator at TAO. If you have any questions or issues during the webinar, feel free to send either of us a private note through the chat. A couple of our guidelines before we start. All of our participants have been muted. Today's panelists encourage the audience to ask questions throughout their presentation. So if you have a question, please let us know in the chat, raise your hand using the participant icons, and we'll make sure you have the opportunity to unmute and ask the panelists directly. Please engage with us on social media during this call and throughout the day. And if you're joining us asynchronously as you view the content, we appreciate all the social support, and you can see where to find us on the slide. Due to our limited time, we will capture all questions in the chat, and any questions we don't get to, we will make sure to get answered later in our online member engagement platform, which is Mobilize. It's our members only virtual community, and our guests will provide written responses there to any unanswered questions from our program today. So if you have any questions about joining Mobilize or TAO, please reach out to membership@techoregon.org. So now a huge thank you to JLL and Facebook for underwriting this series. We appreciate their sponsorship and support. We invite you to join us at 2 p.m. today for our final session of Impact Talent and Culture Edition, which is a Q&A focused on attracting, growing, and sustaining talent, featuring human resources, people and culture professionals from regional tech companies, as well as local government entities. So it's a really interesting group of folks we have, and a nice segue after we discuss building an inclusive workplace, which we know is an important strategy for business success. Developing and retaining employees with an array of experiences and characteristics is key to fostering a workplace that enables you to attract top talent while creating a sense of belonging. With that, I'm delighted to welcome Bijou Menon and Cedric Gutierrez to Impact to find out how businesses are utilizing inclusive language to appeal to the widest talent pool, and how automation, AI, and recruiting technology can help keep your job descriptions bias free. I'm sure everyone can hear my dog, which is why we encourage folks to stay on mute. I'm 99% sure that the mail carrier is here to murder me. We should get through this in a few minutes. So I think I'm going to go on mute and let our panelists introduce themselves so you all don't have to listen to that. So Bijou, I'm going to hand it over to you and let you all introduce yourselves.
Thank you, Kara. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about this important topic. My name is Bijou Menon. I'm the CEO of Fair Hire. We are a technology firm with a vision to create a level playing field. We work towards realizing 2 of the 17 United Nations Sustainability Goals, which is reducing inequality and gender equality. Well, improving gender equality. I suppose we have a role to play in this world, which is shifting and is more aware of the importance of workforce diversity, inclusivity, and equity. And I'm here to share my thoughts and discuss about what future looks like when it comes to technology playing a role in leveling the playing field.
And Cedric, we're still having some dog issues over here. Would you like to introduce yourself before you start on your presentation?
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah, so my name is Cedric Gutierrez. I am an assistant professor at Bocconi University in Milan. In my research, I really do mostly behavioral sciences. So I'm trying to understand how people make decisions. And in particular, I focus on some biases such as overconfidence, or how the attitude toward risk and uncertainty affect decisions. And more recently, I studied investigating some aspect of discrimination using those tools from behavioral sciences, both on the supply side. So what are some elements that may push some candidates to select out from certain jobs, and also on the demand side, so on the recruiter side. Yeah, and I've known Bijou for a while, and we recently started talking about collaborating on academic projects that bring us together today. Should I share my screens?
Yes, I think you should share your screen.
So let me see. Can you see it well? Yeah.
We can, thank you. Yeah.
All right. So when we talked about this presentation, we thought that a good way to start would be to review a bit what we know, and this literature is huge, so I'm going to go quite fast. But what we know about discrimination in the workplace, and why does this happen? But before going there, I just wanted to have a quick word on why should firms engage into diversity, equity, and inclusion. So first of all, the equity and inclusions are part of the grand social challenges of our time. For instance, 3 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations, the one that you can see on the right side of the screen, are related to equity and inclusion. DEI is completely part of the firm's social responsibility, along with other dimensions such as environmental sustainability. And importantly, we see also more and more pressures from stakeholders, whether they are internal or external, for firms to improve their DEI practices. All right. As you mentioned, Kara, in the introduction, it's also beneficial. Diversity is also beneficial for the organization, both at the team level and at the organization or firm level. So we know that having a diverse workforce increases the cognitive diversity, different perspective on a given issue, different experience, and this could lead to positive outcome. And there's also recent literature that directly looks not only at the team level effect of diversity, but at the organization level. And this literature seems to suggest that actually engaging into DEI practices has a very positive outcome for organizations. Hiring socially excluded groups can lead to competitive advantage. There's research that shows that there is a positive relationship between higher corporate sexual equality and stock returns and market valuation. Firms who engage into diversity policies tend to be more innovative. And in the first slide, I talked about stakeholders. So here we have 2 examples of stakeholders. Employees may value the fact that their organization invests in DEI practices. There is evidence of less shirking or absenteeism. And customers may also perceive favorably this. So this is all great, but what the literature also tells us is that while this seems a very bright picture, there is a less bright picture, that is that there seems to be a lot of discrimination when we are talking about recruiting. I didn't want to spend too much time. I just gave a few references, but there is evidence of discrimination, whether we are talking about gender, race, religious background, sexual orientation, but also discrimination based on socioeconomic status and age, or or those kind of other demographic characteristics. So this is a little bit puzzling. We may wonder, if this is so beneficial for organizations to engage into DEI practices, why do we observe what we do? And I thought that in order to tackle the issue, we need to understand why firms discriminate. What does the literature says about it? Historically, the literature, particularly in economics, identified 2 main reasons for the discrimination. The first one that is called taste-based, and the other one statistical-based. So the taste-based discrimination is really this idea of prejudice or animus. Some recruiters or some members inside the organization may have some animus towards members of an out group, and they are willing to pay a price in terms of hiring someone with a lower productivity in order not to interact with those individuals. However, most of the empirical literature suggests that this is not the mechanism that drives discrimination. In the economic literature, the other mechanism, the statistical-based mechanism, finds a lot of empirical support. And this mechanism suggests that recruiting is difficult. So recruiters have to identify the potential level of productivity of an employee based on, of a candidate based on a limited set of information. There is a huge information asymmetry, of course, between the candidate and the recruiter. And the recruiter have limited information and noisy signals about the candidate: resume, phone interview, face-to-face interview. And so what usually we tend to do is that we tend to rely on other sources of information. One way is to use a distribution of productivity, or how we think is the productivity of the overall productivity of a certain group based on some observables, race, gender, and age. And this could lead to discrimination. And both of those types of discrimination are conscious. So for instance, imagine that you are recruiting a candidate, and this candidate has a degree from Cambridge University. So you may receive some ambiguous signal about the quality of the candidate, but you will also take into account the fact that this candidate has studied at Cambridge, and that your interaction with former candidates from Cambridge were good in order to make your judgment about this candidate. While those two types of mechanisms are conscious, there are also other mechanisms that are a little bit less conscious and more implicit that could also lead to discrimination. In particular, there is this idea of stereotyping and role congruity. In this case, recruiters may hold stereotype about a certain social group, and those stereotypes may not be congruent with the attributes that they think are required to be successful in a certain position. So for instance, in this literature that focuses on gender, this literature tells us that usually we tend to associate certain traits, particularly agentic traits, to more men. Agentic traits such as aggressiveness, competitiveness, and more communal traits to women. Communal traits such as being sensitive, honest, understanding. And this may lead to discrimination if a recruiter is looking for a profile that requires some characteristics that are related to agentic traits. And this is not only this automatic stereotyping or automatic discrimination is not only related to gender congruity. There are also other unconscious mental associations that could lead to the same problems. And in fact, there is a paper published about 10 years ago that showed that in the context of recruiting, recruiters that scored higher in the implicit association test, so that are more likely to make those automatic connections between a group and a certain characteristics, were less likely to invite for an interview members of a discriminated group. So here we are talking about a way of thinking that is really fast, the so-called type 1 way of making decision based on heuristic, based on automatic response almost. So the question that we may ask is that recruiting is not only based on an automatic decision. There's also a type 2, more deliberate, more rational way of thinking that kicks in. However, the problem is that we also we fall also often into this anchoring bias, in the sense that of course we update our beliefs about the candidate based on information, but we tend to put too much weight on the original information or on the initial judgment that we have. And there is a nice paper by Rulin and Batnagar recently published that showed that this is the case in recruiting, that people tend to put too much weight on this initial prejudice. And of course, they incorporate new information, but not enough. And this increases discrimination. Other elements that can also increase or moderate the discrimination. There could be discrimination if the recruiter believes that he or she that it is easier for him or her to judge the quality of a candidate that shares some cultural type. And this may be a biased view, but if the recruiter believes that it's easier, then there may be some more discrimination. Importantly, there are some environments that also increase discrimination in recruiting. In particular, high environment of high cognitive load. So imagine that a recruiter has a very limited amount of time and has a very large number of resume to assess. This is a very high cognitive load task, and therefore this will lead to more discrimination. And more use of automatic reasoning. Uncertainty also can also increase discrimination, and there is particularly high uncertainty in the early stage of recruiting, and so this is when we may see a high level of discrimination. And finally, I also wanted to mention the last paper. I find it quite interesting on different levels. The last paper talks about discrimination across jobs. So here it was not so much about not giving access to certain groups, in this case, women, to all the jobs, but selecting on jobs based on gender. And importantly, what they found is the critical role of a mediator in the labor market. So recruiting agencies, in this case, were the ones that were responsible for discrimination. In this case, the customer wanted actually to increase gender diversity in their workforce, but the recruiting agency that was paid based on closing a deal had a biased understanding of the needs of the customer and discriminated. So what can we do? At the individual level, we know that multicultural experiences can reduce discriminatory hiring decisions, and that experience, to some extent, in recruiting can also reduce discriminatory behavior. Importantly, and I think this is something that we will discuss later, the process also of evaluation is very important when it comes to discrimination. And there are some recent papers that show that evaluation that is made jointly rather than separately reduces stereotyping and reliance on stereotype and discrimination. And similarly, partitioning candidates based on certain dimensions, so for example, gender, ethnicity, or education, can reduce discrimination and increase diversity in the workforce. So I'm trying to be fast for the sake of time. What else can we do? There could be some interventions that can also reduce discrimination. There is diversity training are very popular, but the literature seems to suggest that there is mixed evidence in its effectiveness in reducing discrimination. And the two other examples, I wanted to mention them for specific reason. There is a paper that shows that board quota have no effect. The effect of board quota of gender, for instance, on the board of directors does not have an effect on the lower level in the organization. And it's important, I think, to discuss the fact that it's not enough to put in place a practice at a certain level in the organization and expect that it will trickle down in the organization. So this is important to take into consideration. And the other element was that some policies can also, we have to think about the potential detrimental effect of a policy. And in particular, there is this famous example of the bandbox that was a policy that was supposed to restrict employers from asking applicants about their criminal histories. And the idea was to reduce discrimination, and in particular to increase employment of Black men in the U.S. But the policy backfired because then the employers relied even more on their biased perception of the potential candidates. So they had a wrong estimate of the likelihood of a candidate to be to have a criminal history. And of course, related to what we will probably discuss later, blind hiring is also a potential solution for reducing discrimination. There are very interesting paper in published in 2000 that showed that in the orchestra, by using curtains or hiding the candidates, this increased the percentage of women being hired. However, I wanted just to point out that we have to consider the whole process when we are discussing about blind hiring. And there are like two recent papers, one working paper and one published paper, that show that blind hiring certainly reduces discrimination when it comes to getting the interview, but not necessarily getting the job. And the first paper is about discrimination based on age. The second one shows that it's efficient for getting a job for gender discrimination, but not for racial discrimination. So it's important to consider the whole process of recruiting and not just the first step. And this was all. I want to thank my co-author Anne Jacquinet for helping me preparing this presentation. And if you have any questions, feel free to join us, to reach out.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. And I do have some questions that I'm going to just offer over to you all both, and you can decide who wants to answer it. But the first one I have is a lot of times conversations about bias are siloed. And I think you sort of alluded to that, like in the orchestra example, the bias was just around gender. How important is it to create an organizational conversation about biases and help spark ideas on minimizing them at a holistic level and not just in, a single biased standpoint? You showed a slide where there's the different ways that biases present themselves. So how do you truly eliminate all bias?
Maybe I can pitch in quickly before Cedric can expand. So I suppose I'm a big fan of equality and diversity, but I grown to realize that equity plays an important role. So what happens is, especially after Minneapolis incident, there's a concept called white fragility, and whites, especially recorded in the US, are uncomfortable conversation about race and bias, which means they can potentially avoid those conversations. So I suppose my view is it is important to talk about equity and meritocracy, which if we put that in place, there will be less potential of bias occurring. And if at all, and it's important to have the conversations, and if at all we have the conversation, in my view, it has to start from the top. It has the leadership, because once the leadership airs this topic, the whole organization will be much more open to embrace it and have a meaningful conversation. So I suppose it is important, but we have to be very careful based on the geography and the industry and the company, how the conversation narrative should be architected. So yeah, that's my view on that at that point, Kara. But it's a great question.
Yeah, so I certainly agree with Bijou, and I thought about it in a slightly different way, but actually it recoups with what you said, Bijou. It's I thought about it in the sense that organizational decision making is not just the sum of individual decision making. So we need to understand what is the unit that makes the decision when it comes to, for example, recruiting, whether it is a team or an individual. Will not the solutions to reduce biases may not be the same. But importantly, there are also other elements such as the chain of command or the organizational structure, the way people are organized, and the way decisions are made, and their degree of autonomy or levels of hierarchy that may also affect the biases in the organization. And important, related to what Bijou said, there is evidence that people tend to, in organization, they tend to accommodate a third-party prejudice, even if it goes against their own beliefs. So if there is, let's say, a CEO that has specific beliefs about a certain topic, it is important to also take it into account. Otherwise, trying to solve the discrimination issues at a certain level in the organization may not work. So certainly, I also agree with what Bijou said.
I like that. There's organizational and then there's individual, and the organizational is like a buildup of a lot of the individual. And I like, Bijou, what you said too, because I don't think either one of you is joining us today from the US. And so we have our US-centric views, and not all biases are going to be equal across different parts of the world. So it's an interesting topic to kind of explore. So I'm going to ask another question that's more around language. And we heard in our earlier panel or our earlier keynote this morning that language is so important when it comes to the talent and culture narrative. So research has shown that adjectives like competitive and determined are viewed as masculine. And I think that was part of this presentation. And words such as collaborative and cooperative are viewed as the feminine when it comes to job descriptions. So what kind of tools are available for teams to evaluate their current job descriptions to create more gender neutral language?
I'll probably pitch in. So I will probably backtrack to 2011 when Daniel, Aaron, and Justin came up with research where they talked about the importance of language to attract minority groups, and they were especially talking about the gender aspect, where female are, swayed away because they see certain terms which they don't relate to. I speak to organizations across the globe on a regular basis because I try to evangelize the concept of blind hiring and talk about fair hire and so on. What I always get to hear from them is, we can have all the tools, but there are not any talent out there. But I always believed there are talent, but it's distorted because they are not coming to the pipeline, because they don't feel part of the journey because of the language they use. So there is a strong business case that language plays a key role. When it comes to a tool and usage of it, I suppose it is about accessibility, how accessible these tools are for organizations of large, medium, and small size. So large organizations always have big pockets and they can go and purchase tools. But I would probably want to address to smaller and medium organizations that, look, first port of call, if you don't have access to money to purchase a technology solution, is, as Cedric was mentioning about group thinking, bring a female. If you haven't done that when you create a job description, so that you understand the viewpoint from your peers and see whether it is reflecting to their standpoint. And the second port of call is there are a lot of free tools. One, the same report that I mentioned, they came up with a tool which is online, which is called Cat Matfield. So if you go to gender-decoder.catmatfield.com, there's a free tool based on that research. It does a job for you. Then you can always go for fancy tools, including one of ours, which we are going to launch. which we are very proud of, where you can have a bit more breadth in terms of not just gender, but you can look into other aspects which can have an impact in attracting talent. But I think 2021, I mean, early this year, Congress has started adopting it. So which means organizations now are coming forward to use the tools to make sure that problem is tackled. So, for commercial reason, I wouldn't name, commercial tools, but from a free tool perspective, I would strongly recommend gender decoder capmatfield.com. But there are plenty of tools if you do a Google search. If that's okay, Kara, I can't name any company tools.
Bijou, is it possible for you to repeat the tool that you mentioned, the free one? That one was very interesting. For to drop it into the chat.
Oh yeah, sure. So I'll drop it in the chat. It's gender-decoder.catmatfield.com. I will put in the chat so that you can share it with your audience later.
Fantastic, thank you. I do have some more questions. So this one I really like, because this one we get, we hear a lot about it in tech in particular. And I've had the opportunity to work with some folks around the US where they've actually increased the diversity of their pipeline fairly substantially over 5 years by actually eliminating and changing this process. And so this is around skills tests or asking candidates to solve work-related problems is a good way to evaluate candidates versus unconsciously judging them based on assurance, gender, age, and even personality. So have you seen success in the area of skills test, or have you seen that be another form of bias in the hiring process?
I can jump in. Well, I thought there's plenty of points to talk about in that. It's a great question, Kara. So I'm going to change the perspective here. If you think about from a candidate perspective, so research is clearly pointed out something. So Black candidates have to apply 10 times more than a white candidate to get a call back. Think about a candidate who is struggling to find a job. That's a state of mind. You have some panic, nervousness, and all those things. So you have to apply for many jobs to find response. And after a couple of days, you stop trusting the time that you put in and provide the quality. So it's about number game at that point of time. Now, if you're asking the same candidate to spend an hour to fill in a lot of psychometric questionnaires or work-related problems, what we have seen is the number of applications that come down drastically down, which clearly, and also the applications are then come from a majority set in a specific geographical region. So in my view, we have to be very careful when you apply these techniques. We have to look into, okay, we have a set of solutions, let's try to apply it. We have to look into what the world is and what the world is struggling. And accordingly, we have to come up with the right solution. For technical roles, programmers, or even marketing graphic designers, where their portfolios make, is something that can tangibly provide to provide the skills. Yes, fantastic, methodology where we can evaluate the candidate, because that person is going to come to your office and do exactly those things. But if you're looking for other roles, I would recommend to have a combination of a technique, or do an A/B testing before you roll out on organizational level procedures where it involves candidates having to spend a lot of time. Candidates tend to have a resume and a cover letter, and they easily change based on that particular role and apply. So typically take 10-15 minutes. If you ask them to spend an hour or two, they would struggle. So my recommendation, this is from the ground level experience of talking to companies and working with them, that you always have to first do a pilot run on different roles and see whether that's bringing results. And also think about the ecosystem, whether there are enough candidates who could be part of it by spending that much time and effort. For graduate roles, I've seen it as a great fit because the volume is high, as Cedric was saying. So there is a situation where you're under pressure as a HR to sift through volumes of applications. But then again, it goes back to the operational issue for organizations. If you think about a commercial bank who tends to get 10,000 applications, you're asking the HR team to spend a good 30 to 40 minutes to evaluate one candidate, but they have to evaluate 10,000 candidates. So they end up hiring contract workers to fill in and finish that. Then the quality of the evaluation goes down. So it has got an impact, which is again detrimental to the whole process. So I would stick to a process which is more convenient for the candidates to get more candidate pool and make sure your process is much more clean and inclusive so that you can allow them to be part of the recruitment process.
I just wanted to build quickly on this, and so my point of view on it is that I don't think skill tests are necessarily bad, but but they may not fully solve the biases that we discussed about before. To do so, they would need to be succeeding or being performant on those skill tests should be completely uncorrelated with some of the demographic variables that we discussed about, and this may not be the case. So for instance, imagine like in consulting, it's very frequent to use a case-based study. But performing well in those kind of tests also is also be easier for some part of the population. If we talk about education, clearly certain types of education will prepare you to perform extremely well on this skill test. It does not necessarily mean that you will perform extremely well later on the job, but you will be very, very good on this test. And so maybe this could be part of the toolbox, but this can also create other kinds of biases.
If I may jump quickly, Kara, and give you, because I read an article this morning about SAT, and there's a report, I think I read it in Forbes, and the research says there is a strong correlation between those who scored about 700, the top scorers, and the affluent nature of their living. So that probably will prod us to think that why is such strong correlation? Years and years, I mean, year after year. I mean, it's just like 1 year. The sample size is very strong, and it clearly says there's a correlation between top candidates and their families, affluent family status. So that clearly says minorities, and especially Black people, are struggling, and we need to ask the question why. So this is definitely not the answer to the question, but we need to have a diverse pool of processes to make sure which one fits into your organization.
Yeah, and I've often wondered, in what job do you have to get some kind of problem thrown at you with zero context and then are expected to solve it in 10 or 15 minutes? I think my CEO is on this call right now, and if he did that to me, I would probably start laughing. I'd be like, I'm so sorry, you want me to do what in the next 15 minutes? It just doesn't seem like a real world situation a lot of times. So we get asked that a lot, like, what should we do if somebody is in a situation where they're asked to do a skills-based, we come up with a scenario of like a whiteboard problem that you're supposed to write out. And I often think it's just terrifying to have to do that. So let's see what else we got. Oh, the unstructured interview. So unstructured interviews where a candidate's experience and expertise are meant to unfold organically through conversation are often unreliable for predicting job success how can an interview scorecard that grades candidates' responses to each question on a predetermined scale be a more successful tool?
Yeah, so just quickly from what the literature tells us, and I'm always going to bring back the the academic side, but yeah, as you mentioned, this there is evidence that unstructured interviews are not a very good predictor of performance later on the job, and there's also evidence that they can the use of this tool can also increase the recruiter's biases, such as overconfidence, over-reliance on your own judgment, more than by using structured interviews. And interestingly, when it comes to structured interviews, it seems that some of the biases that we discussed about earlier, such as cultural type alignment, so you are similar, you know, the candidate is similar to who I am, whether it is gender, whether it is ethnicity or something else, that seems to be very important. There does not seem to be this effect when using structured interviews, and there are several studies that that find this. So it seems indeed that this is a good tool to at least alleviate a little bit some of the problems we discussed about before.
I could bring some cultural aspect because I've heard a number of stories. I mean, this is the thing. Networking is a key instrument that is used in Western countries, more so in US, to find talent. And sometimes it's very effective to find great talent. But what that does is, if you are evaluating a candidate and not based on a skill-based criteria, you can potentially unfairly rate a candidate based on the conversation they had, which, you know, like to like, or probably they sat in a nice cafe which they similar taste, and that ambience created a better perspective of that particular candidate and so on, which can be unfair to many other candidates who never got that opportunity to be in that situation. So and Fair Hire as a tool does this very elegantly to make sure every interview goes through structure. Every interview can have panels, because panel can bring down the biases, because group thinking comes in play. And evaluation criteria is a map. So every interviewer will evaluate based on the same criteria. They can potentially give feedback if the process allows them, so that it's a level playing field when someone goes past that interview stage. So I suppose organizations are increasingly aware of it, but I think that the tendency of having unstructured interview, in my view, that I have seen is more in startups, because that's the culture. You know, you tend to meet people in cafes and so on, and also in a lot of financial institutions. But again, the process, because of the regulatory aspect of financial institutions, especially in the US and in the UK, that is changing. And they're now having to have protocols in place to make sure everyone goes through the same process to reduce the bias.
We've done structured interviews, and actually one of our panelists this afternoon at 2 works for a city entity, and I actually had the opportunity to do interviews with them as one of the interviewees. And what was really interesting about that process was they talked to us about each of our own biases that we bring, which is why there was structure. But then the step farther, because it is a government entity, all of our notes were public record. And so they very clearly stated, you know, you can't say, I like the way this was described, because that's you taking your personal perspective on what the candidate said. You could only document like what they stated directly in relation to the question. And I thought that was really an interesting way to coach us on how to approach the interview process. And I realized that most private organizations don't have that level of scrutiny on the process, but I think perhaps you should take that mindset, like when you sit down and really, like, to your point, somebody may overinflate what they did, but if you can, write down what they said they did and everyone hears the same thing, and I don't know, it just was a really interesting way to approach that hiring process that I hope she talks about later today. Okay, I've got a couple more as we sort of wind down here. And Cedric, you've said this because we all have this tendency. It's natural to gravitate towards people with whom you instantly gel. And I am very guilty of being like, oh, that extroverted person was great. We should definitely hire them. Is there a way to create a rating of candidates on likability as you would on their other skills during the interview process, so that your different personal perspectives, again, going back to the previous question, aren't like clouding your hiring judgment?
So yeah, you're right. We all tend to fall into, I don't know if it's a bias, but we, birds of a feather, we all tend to like somehow people who are similar to us. What is clear is that this is important, and this should be taken into consideration when hiring someone, because we know that this is important for organizational success, and that being surrounded by colleagues that we feel likable, that we can connect with, can increase commitment to organization, team spirit, willingness to collaborate, willingness to share information. So this is a valid point to take into consideration. That being said, as you said, it is very subjective and also very dependent on who I am as a recruiter compared to the candidate. So what you suggest, I guess, is to have a specific criterion in the separated from the rest of the evaluation that could be taken into account, but that on which we can maybe also analyze whether there is a constant bias, or and I think this would be this is a good idea. This would be a good thing.
If I may quickly jump in, Kara, I suppose we don't have to be like each other to like each other. You don't have to be like each other, right? To like each other. So I think that's a very, very strong statement, because the need for likability needs to be defined in terms of company values, and not the cultural fit, so to speak. So how do we define that is a key question. I think we have to go to abstract layer and see what is the shareholder value that the business is working towards. Is the candidate going to contribute to that value? And if we can define likability based on that, I think it will have much more positive impact to the whole process, rather than likability based on the fact that we both play golf, or we both go for sailing and so on. And reality is, when it comes to that moment, when you do that interview, you end up, if there is a charming candidate, you just end up liking based on the charm you're thrown upon. That I think Cedric quoted in his presentation that may not relate to success. So yeah, it's a very interesting, I think much debated in the web, as I understand this aspect, because that has caused a lot of issues, because you have candidates in play. We have an important project happening. We need 100 resources in 2 months, and we ended up hiring 100 resources, but most of the resources end up being great, but not fit for the job. In my view, I think we should look into the bigger picture and see whether candidates, the resources that brings in, provide the skill set that can increase the shareholder value. And I think if you take that as the yardstick, I think there can be a difference in the approach.
Excellent. All right, I've got one more. I'm enjoying this conversation. How important is it to track how well you've done against the diversity goals your company has set out to achieve with each hire?
I suppose I can jump in quickly on this as well. I mean, this is a fantastic topic. I mean, Fair Hire is known for the diversity analytic, and that is the reason we won Disruptor of the Year. As Cedric mentioned, blind hiring is not complete just by introducing anonymization in the beginning. It's about identifying the patterns that could potentially happen post-interview stages, which is where panel plays a role, which is where principle of accountability plays a role. And that will determine whether you can actually hire a diverse workforce who's also fitting to the meritocratic aspect of hiring. Now, my recommendation is, this is based on the numbers. Organizations tend to roll out candidates, 1/4 of the candidate, 1/4 of the resource in organization keeps changing every year. So 25%. If you try to tackle workforce diversity in a year, you end up probably trying to tick the box. And what that could do, this is real-time experience, because we started working on pro-diversity initiatives since 2015. So we kind of gained a lot of experience, real experience. We went through that evolution. What we have seen is when candidates come and join organization and they sit in meetings, they have their projects gone through one phase, and they realize that I'm here because of tick box exercise. I'm not here because I'm valued. And what that does is they move out and they quit the organization in no time. And that can backfire in everything that we have done in order to create a diverse workforce. So my view is, yes, we need to have goals, we need to monitor, but we shouldn't get paranoid on meeting the goals in year one, because it is an evolution. It is not a revolution. Because if you try to tick the box, it can backfire, and we have seen it happening. So you have to look into a sustainable process, move the problem out of people, bring it to process layer, have the right process, technology, and so on in place, and level the playing field and get people who never got that opportunity, social mobility, and so on, bring to the game. But make sure people with high skill, give them opportunity, because they never got that opportunity to sit in front of interviewer and express the candidature. And if you do that carefully and gradually, you will have a quality diverse workforce, which is sustainable, wherein you can create role models. Otherwise, you will try to take shortcuts and could backfire, and you're, same as square one after 18 months, then you're going to start all again. So my view is it's important to track, it's important to set goals, but we have to be very realistic. And you can't put pressure on a chart to change the game in 6 months. But you have to put pressure on a chart to create the right process in place, so that as you move forward from year 1 to year 2 to year 3, you will end up having a much more diverse workforce, which will create the same financial performance which McKinsey was talking about, which will boost the company productivity and so on. And that's my take on this question. It's an excellent question, Kara.
Yeah, I agree with what you said, Biju. And so clearly setting goals is important, right? We know that at both individual and organizational level, having some goals that are specific, quantifiable, challenging but achievable is a driver of effort and motivation. So certainly, if we want change to happen, having some clear goals is important. However, your question was a bit more specific and mentioned the fact that should we have specific goals for every single hire, and I would tend to agree with Biju that probably not. It's important to monitor it, right? So to take it into consideration, but certainly we cannot judge whether a hire is biased on a sample of one, right? So this would be a mistake to make such a judgment with a very, very small sample. So looking at the broader picture, but maybe not judging a recruiter based on a very, very small sample.
Spoken like somebody that does actual research. Thank you for that. I appreciate this. We have a couple more minutes. We don't have any more questions. So I was going to see if each of y'all wanted to maybe close out with a final thought before we say goodbye to our live participants and get this edited for our folks that will be viewing throughout the next couple of weeks. But just sort of final thoughts on eliminating bias from the hiring process. We know it's a very important and hot topic right now. So I'll let you two give us some last perspectives.
So maybe I'll start and then I will let Biju finish. So my thought is that it is a very important and very complex problem, right? And so, and this is also the kind of discussion that we had with Bijou, is that I think that it's important not to think that there are some, solutions that are magical and that are easy. We saw that, I mean, there are a lot of tools that can help. It's important to look at the whole process. And it's important to change the culture, change the way we see things, but it's important to think deeply about the changes that we make in order, as Bijou said, sometimes it can also, some solutions can backfire. So to think that it is a complex problem that needs complex solutions.
So I was talking to Cedric recently on the behavioral aspect of organizations moving from one state to other, and this is specifically on the Kubler-Ross model, where you take pandemic, you take any societal issues like global warming, and diversity is just one other issue where one will go through different state of mind. They start with the shock, they move to denial stage, and they get frustrated, and they start experimenting, thinking that, okay, the problem exists. And then eventually they recognize that we need to do something about it and start taking decisions. And then they accept and embrace and come up with a solution. I suppose as an organization, one has to be very open about the fact that bias exists. And it's very human trait and behavior. And recognize where you are in the stage, whether the organization is backing you when it comes to taking that initiative, and make some strong decisions to transform the way you're hiring, because it has to change. That is no doubt. It is limiting people, gender neutral languages, blind hiring, panels, diverse panels, and all those methodologies are there. Think from candidate perspective, empower HR, because they need to be empowered. We need a lot of HR leaders. How many HR C-level chief human resource officers have become CEOs? I mean, the numbers are very less. I read a statistics, more COOs, CFOs, even CMOs go to CEOs. That clearly says that we need to empower HR, so that they can demonstrate the leadership, and they need to have the leadership skill to deliver such transformational programs like workforce diversity. And so my, the message, so to speak, here is, if you bring together all these, if the management is behind the change, the organization is going to embrace it. And before you know, you have an organization with people who acknowledges that a disabled person or blind person or LGBTQI person can sit in the same room and contribute to the problem solving. And this is exactly what we want in the years to come. And this is something that we are working towards to support organizations to catalyze the change. But that said, I'm very thankful, Kara, giving this opportunity. We can talk a lot about it because it's a very interesting topic. It's very hard to concise our message in an hour and deliver it. And thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you both very much. And we're perfect timing. I don't know if you were watching on purpose, but we're right at the end of our hour. Enjoyed this. We will get the video recording out. We'll share it with you all so you can share it with your networks. And to everyone that attended this afternoon, thanks so much. We hope to see you at 2. And in the meantime, everybody have a really great rest of your day, wherever you're joining us in from around the world. So take care and see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Cedric.
Goodbye, Bijou.